The smell of linseed oil came through the window before dawn. It was not an unpleasant smell, slightly warm, slightly nutty, with something underneath it that was either the pigment or the turpentine or both, a smell that belonged to workshops and not to anywhere else. Giulia had grown up with this smell and no longer noticed it most of the time. But in the first moments of waking, before the rest of the day imposed itself, she would catch it fresh and remember that she lived next to something remarkable. Her neighbor, the workshop of Master Benedetto, painted things that people would be looking at long after everyone now alive was gone. She did not think of it in quite those terms. She thought, Benedetto's boys are already at work. Then she thought about bread. Welcome back to dull tales. If you're in bed right now, if the lights are low and the day is behind you, then you're exactly where this is made for. Tonight we're going to Florence, but not the Florence of art history textbooks. Not the Florence of broad pronouncements about humanism and rebirth. We're going to the Florence of 1480, in the middle of the Medici period, in a city that smells of horse dung and river water and linseed oil, where genius is a workshop industry, and beauty is produced by apprentices who sweep floors and grind pigments before they learn to paint. This is the Florence of Giulia, a cloth merchant's widow who manages the family business with a precision that her late husband would have found, had he been alive to see it, slightly intimidating. This is the Florence of Marco, a 19-year-old apprentice in Master Benedetto's workshop, who has been in Florence for 3 years from the countryside, and who has just been given permission to paint his first background sky. This is the Florence of Sir Cristofano, a notary of the Signoria, the city government, whose days are consumed by the documentation of transactions that keep the city's complex legal and commercial life functioning. And it is the Florence of Sister Chiara, a Dominican nun at the Convent of Santa Maria Novella, whose embroidery work is among the finest in the city and whose inner life is more complicated than the embroidery suggests. There is a new story here every day. Subscribe if you want to be here every time one arrives. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's go to Florence. Somewhere out there, it's always 3 in the morning. Somewhere out there, it's always 3 in the morning. Florence in 1480 was a city of approximately 50,000 people. This made it one of the largest cities in Europe, larger than most, smaller than Venice, about the same size as London or Paris. 50,000 people, in a space that a modern city would consider a neighborhood. A compact urban density of workshops, churches, palaces, markets, streets too narrow for 2 carts to pass, and the Arno River running through the middle of it with the Ponte Vecchio spanning it, the bridge lined with the goldsmith shops and butcher stalls that occupied both sides of its length. The city had been building wealth for 2 centuries through the wool trade, the banking business, and the silk industry that had grown alongside the older wool trade. The Medici, who had been the city's dominant political family since Cosimo de' Medici's return from exile in 1434, had made Florence the center of European banking. Their branches stretched from London to Constantinople. The letters of credit they issued were accepted across the trading world. The wealth that flowed through the Medici Bank and the associated merchant networks funded the art, the architecture, the philosophy, the literature that the Renaissance would produce. The Medici did not fund art out of pure generosity. They funded it because beauty was a form of political power, because the palace you built and the chapel you endowed, and the altarpiece you commissioned said something about your family's position and permanence that no amount of military force could say as clearly. Lorenzo de' Medici, who had been managing the family's affairs since 1469, was 31 in 1480. He was not yet called the Magnificent. That was a title that would accumulate over the course of his life. But he was already what he was, a political operator of extraordinary skill, a genuine poet in the Tuscan vernacular, a collector of ancient manuscripts and gems, a patron of the artists and philosophers who had gathered in Florence, because Florence was where things were happening. He was the gravity that held the city's cultural world in orbit. Master Benedetto's workshop was in the Via dei Servi, a narrow street in the northern part of the city, and it operated with the structured efficiency of a well-run small industry. The workshop had 12 people in it at any given time. Benedetto himself, 47, the master, with the reputation and the connections that brought in commissions. 3 journeyman painters who could produce completed work under his supervision. 6 apprentices at various stages of training. And 2 workshop assistants whose job was the material preparation that made the painting possible, grinding pigments, preparing panels, mixing the chalk and glue that went under the painted surface, maintaining the supply of the various materials that a busy Florentine painting workshop consumed in quantity. The system was designed to maximize output. A single painter working alone could complete perhaps 1 significant altarpiece per year. Benedetto's workshop could produce 3, sometimes 4, while also taking smaller commissions, portrait panels, devotional works for private households, the decorative work that Florentine merchants increasingly wanted for their palazzi. This production scale was how the Renaissance worked, not the isolated genius, the single inspired hand. The organized workshop, the distributed labor, the master's vision implemented by a team of people trained to realize it. Marco had been part of this team for 3 years. He had spent his first year on nothing but panel preparation and pigment grinding. He had spent his second year watching, drawing hundreds of drawings from the workshop's collection of study drawings, from the sculpture and architecture of the city, from life when Benedetto allowed it. In his 3rd year, he had begun to paint. Simple things, the decorative borders of altarpieces, the architectural backgrounds of narrative scenes, the flat gold leaf work that required patience and precision rather than expressive skill. 2 weeks ago, Benedetto had told him to paint the sky in the upper quarter of a panel depicting the Annunciation. This was the commission for a minor noble family's private chapel. The sky was a simple thing, gradated blue, the kind that Italian painters had developed a specific technique for producing. But it was his sky, his hand, his first contribution to a work that would hang in a chapel and be seen and prayed before. He had been thinking about nothing else for 2 weeks. The pigments that Marco ground were the foundation of everything. In 1480, paint was not purchased in tubes from an art supply shop. It was made, in the workshop, from raw materials that were themselves the product of complex trade networks spanning the known world. Ultramarine, the brilliant blue that appears in the robes of the Virgin across hundreds of Renaissance paintings, was made from lapis lazuli, the blue stone that came from the mines of Afghanistan by caravan and ship. It was extraordinarily expensive, more expensive by weight than gold. A commission that specified ultramarine for the Virgin's robe was specifying a significant material cost, and the contract between the painter and the patron would typically specify how much ultramarine was to be used, ensuring that the patron was getting the expensive blue they had paid for rather than a cheaper substitute. Vermillion, the brilliant red, was made from mercuric sulfide, either extracted from the mineral cinnabar or produced synthetically. The synthesis process involved heating mercury and sulfur together in a sealed vessel, a procedure that produced toxic fumes and required the workshop assistant doing it to take certain precautions that were imperfectly understood but recognized as necessary. Lead white, the most important white, was made by exposing lead plates to acetic acid vapors in sealed containers, a process that produced the white carbonate of lead by a reaction that took weeks. The lead white was essential for mixing tints and creating the highlights that gave Renaissance flesh painting its luminosity. It was also, slowly and cumulatively, toxic. The painters who worked with it all their lives accumulated lead in their systems. Some historians have speculated that this chronic lead exposure contributed to the psychological and health difficulties that afflicted some Renaissance painters later in life. Whether this is true is difficult to confirm at this distance. What is certain is that the workshop mixed and used these materials without any particular concern for their long-term effects, because the concept of chronic occupational exposure did not yet exist in the terms that would allow it to be recognized and addressed. Marco ground pigments. He did not think about what he was grinding. He thought about the sky. Giulia's cloth business occupied the ground floor of the palazzo where she lived. The palazzo was modest by Florentine standards, not one of the great new buildings that the city's richest families were erecting in the currently fashionable style of ancient Roman architecture, with their rusticated stone facades and their classical proportions. It was an older building, late Trecento, with the more irregular facade of an earlier aesthetic. But it had a good ground floor with high ceilings and wide doors, suitable for the display and storage of cloth, and a good upper floor where the family had always lived. The family now was Giulia and her two sons, Tommaso, 16, who was being trained in the business, and Roberto, 13, who was at school with the Dominicans, and who showed no particular aptitude for cloth but considerable aptitude for Latin. Giulia managed the business with the efficiency of someone who had been watching it closely for 20 years, and who had, over the course of her husband's long illness and death, gradually taken over its actual operation while he held the theoretical authority. She knew the prices of cloth from Flemish Bruges and from Florentine wool, and from the silk workshops of the Nishigen district in Suzhou. Well, not Suzhou specifically, she would not have known the name, but the eastern silk that arrived via Venice from wherever the east was. She knew which customers paid promptly and which customers needed reminders. She knew which Florentine merchant families were in a strong financial position and which were overextended, because this information traveled in the network of relationships that every merchant family maintained, and maintaining it was as important as maintaining the cloth inventory. She was a member, informally, of a network of widows and wives who managed businesses across the city. There was no guild for this. There was no formal recognition of these women's commercial competence. But the network existed, and its members shared information about customers, about prices, about the various practical difficulties of conducting business in a world that did not formally acknowledge that they were conducting it. The Medici Bank's influence on Florentine daily life was so pervasive that it was difficult to see, in the same way that it is difficult to see the air. Banking in the modern sense, the institution that takes deposits and makes loans and issues letters of credit, was a Florentine innovation. The Florentines had developed the instruments of international finance over the previous century and a half. The bill of exchange that allowed merchants to transfer funds across European cities without physically moving gold. The letter of credit that allowed a traveler to draw funds from a foreign branch of the home bank. The debenture bookkeeping system that made the tracking of complex transactions possible. These were not romantic inventions. They were practical solutions to practical problems, developed by merchants who needed to conduct business across large distances in a world where moving physical gold was expensive, dangerous, and inefficient. But their cumulative effect was the creation of a financial infrastructure that transformed the European economy. Sir Cristofano, the notary, worked in the overlap between this financial infrastructure and the city's legal system. His job was to document things, contracts, property transfers, marriage agreements, business partnerships, wills. Every significant transaction in Florentine life required documentation, and documentation required a notary, and the notary's records were the city's memory. Cristofano had been a notary for 22 years. He had a small office near the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of city government, with 2 clerks who copied documents and a shelf of his own registers going back to the beginning of his practice. In those registers was a compressed social history of Florence. Who had married whom, who had sold what to whom, who had left what to which children, who had entered into business partnership with whom under what terms. He knew more about the private lives of Florentine families than anyone who did not specifically study them had any reason to know. He kept this knowledge with the discretion his profession required. He did not gossip. He occasionally drank wine with the men whose transactions he documented and allowed himself an opinion about the weather. He kept the rest behind the professional face, endofprt. Sister Chiara had entered the convent of Santa Maria Novella at the age of 17. She was 34 now, and the convent was the only adult life she had known. The decision to enter had not been entirely hers. The convent was a solution to the problem of a dowry that her family could not comfortably provide for all three daughters, and she had been the second daughter, the one for whom the mathematics worked out most conveniently to religious life. She had not resisted. She had not particularly wanted to resist. The alternatives available to an unmarried woman of modest means in 15th century Florence were not numerous, and the convent offered something that the alternatives did not. A community of women, a structured life organized around rhythm and purpose, and the space for the interior development that she had always sensed she needed, and that the world of the merchant household did not easily accommodate. She had made the most of it. She had become an extraordinary embroiderer. The embroidery at Santa Maria Novella was its own art, producing vestments and altar cloths and devotional pieces that circulated into the city's churches and private chapels, and occasionally, out of Florence, entirely as diplomatic gifts or commissions from patrons in other cities. Chiara's specialty was the human face in embroidery, a technical challenge, because embroidery is fundamentally a linear medium, and the human face requires the subtle gradation of tonal value that line alone cannot achieve. She had developed, over 15 years of practice, a technique of laying stitches at varying angles to catch light differently and suggest tonal depth. It was, in a different medium, the same problem that Marco was solving in his sky: how to create the impression of depth and gradation with the materials available. Both of them were solving it with patience, attention, and the specific knowledge of their craft. Neither of them knew the other existed. They were in the same small city, doing the same fundamental thing. This is how specialization works. The Arno River that ran through the center of Florence was not a clean river. It was the city's working waterway, the source of water for the wool-washing operations that were central to the cloth industry, the carrier of the effluents from those same operations, the receptor of the city's various waste streams. The Arno smelled. In summer, when the water level dropped and the flow slowed, it smelled considerably. This was not a Florentine peculiarity. Every medieval and early modern city with a river treated its river this way, because the concept of water as a common resource requiring protection from pollution did not exist in terms that would have been recognized as a practical governing principle. Water was water. You took what you needed from it upstream, and you put what you needed to dispose of into it further downstream. The arrangement was efficient in the short term and catastrophic in the long term, but the long term was not yet visible. The mills along the Arno, fulling mills for the cloth industry, grain mills that ground the flour for the city's bread, used the river's flow to power their machinery. The tanners used the river for the washing and processing of hides. The dyers used it for rinsing their cloth. The fishermen fished in it despite everything, and the fish they caught were eaten despite everything, because fish was food and the city needed food, and you did not interrogate the water quality of your food supply in terms that the era had no language for. The Ponte Vecchio carried the city across it. The bridge's shops, at this point occupied by butchers as well as goldsmiths, a combination whose hygienic implications were resolved later by decree, had their waste disposal handled by the simple expedient of gravity and the river below. The Arno received all of this and continued to flow. Rivers are patient in ways that cities are not. The food of Florence in 1480 was organized by the logic of the climate, the trade routes, the guild regulations, and the social hierarchy that determined who could afford what. At the top of the hierarchy, the great Florentine families, who ate from the products of their rural estates and the imports that their trading connections made available. Wild game from hunting estates. Fine wines from their vineyards, spices, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, that arrived via the Levantan trade routes and that were expensive enough to be a marker of status. The spiced dishes of the aristocratic table were partly about flavor and partly about display. Here is a household that can afford the spices that come from the other side of the world. In the middle, the merchant families and the skilled artisans, who ate well by most historical standards. Meat several times a week, fresh bread from the many bakeries, wine from the ordinary Tuscan production that was abundant and cheap, vegetables and legumes that the market vendors brought in from the surrounding countryside. Giulia's household ate at this level. She bought good bread, reasonable meat, the seasonal vegetables that the market offered, and the olive oil that was central to Tuscan cooking, in a way that butter was central to Northern European cooking. The olive oil of the region was its own product, pressed from the groves that covered the hillsides around the city, and the quality of a family's oil was a matter of household pride. At the bottom, the wool workers and the day laborers and the servants, who ate bread and beans and whatever cheap protein the market offered. Bread and beans, fava beans especially, the cibrio that was the poor man/s protein across Tuscany, with seasonal vegetables when available, a little oil, occasionally a bit of salt fish on feast days. The Florentine economy created extreme wealth alongside real poverty, and the diet showed it. The workers whose labor made the cloth that funded the banking that paid for the art ate bread and beans. The patrons who commissioned the art ate meat and spices. The distance between these tables was not just about food. Marco/S day began at the 6th hour sunrise, with the morning prayers that Master Benedetto required of the workshop. This was not universal among Florentine workshops, but Benedetto was a man of genuine religious practice, and he believed that a workshop that began its day with prayer began it with the correct orientation toward the work. The prayers were brief, a paternoster, an Ave Maria, the beginning of the day formally acknowledged. Then breakfast, bread and a little salt fish that the workshop/s cook prepared, eaten quickly at the long table in the workshop/s ground floor room while Benedetto reviewed the day/s tasks. 3 journeymen were working on a large altarpiece commission for a chapel in Santa Croce, the Franciscan church at the opposite end of the city. 2 other apprentices were doing the gold leaf work on a cassone, a decorated marriage chest. Marco had his sky. Benedetto came to look at what Marco had done the previous day, 3 hours of work on the upper left quadrant of the panel, the blue gradation from deep at the top to the lighter, more luminous blue near the horizon. Benedetto looked at it for a long moment. He said, "The gradation is correct." This was high praise. Benedetto did not offer unnecessary encouragement. He moved on to review the altarpiece. Marco went back to the panel and looked at his 3 hours of work and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that he was perhaps going to be a painter. Not yet, but perhaps. He picked up his brush. The Renaissance was not the way it is often described in the popular imagination. The popular image is one of sudden awakening, as if medieval Europe had been in the dark, and then, around 1400 in Florence, the lights came on. This is a metaphor that tells a useful story but tells it incorrectly. The medieval period was not dark. It had its own arts, its own philosophy, its own intellectual tradition, its own buildings of extraordinary ambition and technical achievement. The cathedrals of Northern Europe, built in the preceding centuries, were engineering achievements as impressive as anything the Romans had done. The scholastic philosophers of the universities had built an intellectual system of extraordinary sophistication. The illuminated manuscripts of the monastic scriptoria were visual art of the highest order. None of this was darkness. What changed in Florence in the 15th century was something more specific than the lighting of a general lamp. What changed was the relationship between the present and the past, specifically the ancient past, the Greek and Roman world that had preceded the medieval period. Florentine humanists began reading Latin texts with a new philological precision. They began recovering ancient manuscripts. They began applying the standards of classical rhetoric and philosophy to the problems of their own time. and the artists of Florence began looking at ancient sculpture and ancient architecture, not as the remnants of a pagan past to be regarded with caution, but as models of technical excellence to be studied and learned from. This was not a rejection of Christianity. Most of the artists and scholars of the Florentine Renaissance were sincere Christians. It was a broadening of the available sources of excellence, a sense that the Greeks and Romans had known things about beauty and proportion and human form that the intervening centuries had partially lost, and that could be recovered. The recovery project is what we call the Renaissance. It was a specific project, undertaken by specific people in a specific city, with specific motivations and specific results. It was not a metaphor. Sir Cristofano_S mourning was organized by the rhythm of the Signoria_S administrative calendar. The Florentine government of 1480 was a republic in the specific Florentine sense, which is to say, a republic governed by a small elite of established merchant families, with various councils and committees and electoral procedures that ensured no single family could permanently dominate while simultaneously ensuring that the laboring classes had no meaningful political voice. It was a form of government that Florentine civic culture took enormous pride in, comparing itself favorably to the monarchies of France and England and the despotisms of Milan and Naples. It was also a form of government that the Medici had quietly but comprehensively captured, not by abolishing the republican institutions, but by controlling who occupied them. Through the management of the electoral process, the cultivation of a network of clients and allies who reliably supported Medici interests, and the simple fact that the Medici Bank_S financial resources made them indispensable to any faction that wanted to accomplish anything. Cristofano worked within this system without particular enthusiasm or particular resentment. He documented what needed to be documented. He applied the law to the cases that came before him. He did not have opinions about politics, or if he did, he kept them in the same private place where he kept his knowledge of other people_S private lives. This was not cowardice. It was professional discipline. A notary who expressed political opinions became a partisan, and a partisan was no longer trusted by the other side. The notary_S usefulness depended on being trusted by everyone. Cristofano was trusted by everyone. He had been building this trust for 22 years. It was the work he was most proud of, though he would not have said so to anyone. The Duomo, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, was visible from almost everywhere in Florence. Brunelleschi_S dome, completed in 1436, was the largest dome built since the Pantheon in Rome, a feat of engineering that had been considered, before Brunelleschi proposed his solution, essentially impossible. The dome rose over the city on 8 curved ribs of white marble, its terracotta tiles in a herringbone pattern, the lantern at its peak catching the light at certain times of day in a way that made it appear to glow. In 1480, the dome was 44 years old. It was already, to the Florentines who had grown up with it, simply part of the sky, not a marvel but a fact, the way the hills around the city were a fact, as permanent seeming as geography. The people who remembered when the dome had not been there were old. For most of the city_S population, the dome had always been there. Marco, arriving from the countryside 3 years ago, had seen it from a distance before he entered the city, and had not, at that point, understood what he was looking at. His first full view of it from inside the city, from a street near the cathedral, looking up at the curve of the dome against the sky, had been the first moment in his life that he had felt he was somewhere genuinely different from anywhere he had been before. He had stood looking at it for several minutes. Then he had continued to the workshop address he had been given, because he was already 2 days late. He thought about the dome sometimes when he was working on the sky of the Annunciation. He was not painting a dome. He was painting the sky above the dome. But the dome had shown him that the distance between conception and execution was not fixed, that things that seemed impossible were sometimes simply things that hadn't been done yet. He found this thought useful. The question of perspective, linear perspective, the geometric system for representing three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface, had been worked out in Florence in the 1420s by Brunelleschi. He had demonstrated it with a painted panel of the baptistry in front of the baptistry itself, viewed through a hole in the back of the panel, with a mirror to compare the painting to the reality. The match was, by the accounts of those who witnessed it, extraordinary. The system had been described theoretically by the humanist Leon Battista Alberti in his treatise Della Pittura, published in 1435. By 1480, it was the fundamental principle of Florentine painting. Every painter used it. Every apprentice was taught it. The geometric construction of the picture plane, the vanishing point, the orthogonals, the horizon line, was as basic to the workshop's practice as the preparation of the panel. Marco had learned perspective from a diagram that Benedetto kept in the workshop's teaching portfolio, a diagram that he had been required to copy 3 times until he understood it in his hands as well as in his head. He understood it, but understanding perspective and using it to create the feeling of space in a painting were 2 different things. The geometry could be done correctly, and the painting could still feel flat, the figures suspended in a system of lines rather than inhabiting a world. What Benedetto had been teaching the workshop, through the demonstration of his own work and through the occasional lecture, and through the years of correction. The foot is too large relative to the figure. The ground is not receding correctly. The shadow falls wrong for that light source. Was the move from the geometrically correct to the visually convincing. This was the real art. Not the system but the experience of the system. Not the rules but the world that the rules were trying to describe. The guild system organized Florentine economic life with a thoroughness that a modern person would find both impressive and suffocating. The Art della Lana, the wool guild, regulated every aspect of wool production, from the import of the raw fleece to the finishing of the cloth. The Art di Calamala, the merchants' guild, controlled the import and finishing of foreign cloth. The Art della Seda, the silk guild, governed the silk industry. And so through the 7 major guilds and the 14 minor guilds that together organized the city's entire economic life. Guild membership was required to practice most trades. Guilds set quality standards, wages, prices, and conditions of apprenticeship. They maintained courts for resolving disputes between members. They funded charity for members in need. They organized the religious processions and civic ceremonies that punctuated the Florentine year. The guilds were not just economic institutions. They were the primary social organizations of the city's working population. Benedetto's workshop operated under the Guild of the Painters, which was part of the Art dei Medici e Speziali, the Physicians and Apothecaries Guild, because painters used pigments that were classified as the Speziali's domain. The guild recorded the master-apprentice contracts. It mediated disputes. It set the terms under which Marco had been apprenticed, a specified number of years, specified conditions, the legal framework that defined the relationship between him and Benedetto. Marco did not think much about the guild. He thought about the sky. But the guild was the invisible structure within which his thinking about the sky was possible. The Platonic Academy that Lorenzo de' Medici had established at the Villa of Cergi, just north of the city, was not a formal institution. It was a gathering, a rotating group of scholars, philosophers, and poets who met at the villa to discuss the ideas of Plato and the Neoplatonist philosophers. The central figure was Marsilio Ficino, who had translated the complete works of Plato into Latin for the first time, a project that Lorenzo's grandfather Cosimo had commissioned and that Ficino had devoted his life to completing. The ideas that circulated through the academy were not merely academic exercises. They shaped the conceptual vocabulary of Florentine culture, the way that educated Florentines thought about the relationship between beauty and truth, about the nature of love, about the soul's relationship to the divine. The concept of Platonic love, Amor Platonicus, was Ficino's coinage, or rather his translation of a Platonic idea into a form that Renaissance culture could use. The idea that beauty was a trace of the divine in the material world, that the contemplation of beauty was a form of spiritual ascent, that the artist who created beauty was participating in a cosmic process. This had profound implications for how art was understood and how artists understood themselves. Before this conceptual framework, a painter was a craftsman, a skilled tradesman like a goldsmith or a carpenter, respected for his skill but not elevated above other skilled tradespeople. After this framework, the artist became something more, a vehicle for the expression of divine beauty, a mediator between the visible and the invisible, a figure whose creative act was analogous to the creation of the world itself. Leonardo da Vinci, who was 28 in 1480 and was working in Florence at this time, was beginning to think about painting in these terms. Benedetto was not Leonardo. He was a competent master of the established tradition, but he had absorbed from the culture around him a seriousness about the work that went beyond its status as skilled labor. He prayed before his day began. He looked at his work as if it had to be worth looking at, which is a different standard than simply completing it. He passed this seriousness to his apprentices. Marco had absorbed it. He would not have been able to articulate it, but when he picked up his brush to paint the sky, he felt the weight of it. The streets of Florence in 1480 were a continuous performance of social hierarchy. Dress communicated status with a precision that a modern audience, in a world of relatively democratic clothing, might find difficult to fully reconstruct. The sumptuary laws, regulations governing who could wear what, specified the materials, colors, and ornamentation appropriate to each social level. Silk for the wealthy, wool of specific grades for the middling sort, coarser cloth for workers. The regulations were not perfectly observed. The desire to dress above one's station was as universal as it has ever been, and enforcement was intermittent, but the general legibility of dress as social signifier was real. You could look at a person on the street of Florence and within a few seconds read their approximate social position. You would not always be right, but you would be approximately right often enough for the system to function. Giulia dressed appropriately for the widow of a merchant of her standing. Good wool cloth in the colors that the period associated with bourgeois respectability, adequate jewelry, not ostentatious, appropriate to a woman who was running a business and needed to be taken seriously without inviting the attention that conspicuous wealth attracted. She had learned this calibration from her mother, who had learned it from hers. The management of presentation was a skill passed through families like the skills of the craft. It required the same kind of reading of the environment, who was watching, what they would see, what inference they would draw that Benedetto's perspective training required. You constructed the scene. You placed yourself in it. You managed what the viewer received. The Convent of Santa Maria Novella produced its work in the hours allocated to labor in the divine office's daily schedule. The Dominicans, whose order ran the convent, organized the day around the 7 canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Each of these hours was a time of prayer, punctuating the day at regular intervals from before dawn to after dark. Between the prayer hours were the hours of labor, study, and the community life of the convent. For Chiara, the labor hours meant the embroidery workshop. She worked on a vestment, a cope, the large semicircular vestment worn by the priest for solemn occasions, that had been commissioned by a Florentine merchant family for a specific chapel. The cope's embroidery was elaborate. Scenes from the life of the Virgin in the main field, borders of stylized flowers and geometric patterns, the family's heraldic device worked into a corner. The faces in the embroidery were what mattered most. The Virgin's face in the central scene must be beautiful without being merely decorative. The beauty had to be of the kind that came from within, that expressed the interiority of a being whose relationship with the divine was complete. Chiara was not sure she could do this. She had done it before in other pieces, But each face was its own problem, and the previous solutions did not automatically transfer. She was working on the angle of the thread in the shadow beneath the Virgin's cheekbone when the bell for sext rang. She set down the needle. She rose. She went to the chapel. The thread would be there when she returned. The face would wait. Patience was the primary skill of her craft, which is to say it was the primary practice of her life. The Florentine calendar was saturated with religious observances. In a year of approximately 365 days, the liturgical calendar specified more than 40 feast days on which work was prohibited or reduced. The major feasts of the Christian year, the feasts of the patron saints of the guilds, the feast of San Giovanni, Florence's patron, which was celebrated on June 24th with a pageant and a horse race that essentially shut the city down for a day. The Palio di San Giovanni was not the Sienese Palio that tourists come from around the world to see today. That race was already ancient. Florence's race ran through the streets of the city itself, from Santa Maria Novella to Santa Croce, the two great Dominican and Franciscan churches at opposite ends of the city. The race was preceded by a procession in which the representatives of Florence's subject towns and allies brought tribute to the Signoria, a display of the city's power and reach. Then the horses ran. The city watched. The race lasted perhaps 15 minutes. The year of pageantry and preparation for those 15 minutes was its own form of civic art. Marco had seen the procession on his first summer in Florence, positioned at the corner of the Via dei Calzaioli with a borrowed view over the heads of the crowd. He had tried to memorize what he saw, the colors of the processional standards, the costumes of the participants, the way a crowd moves and what it does to the light when 10,000 people are packed into a street. He had gone back to the workshop and drawn for 3 hours from memory. Benedetto had looked at the drawings without comment. The following week, he had given Marco a slightly more complex assignment in the altarpiece. This was the curriculum, not praise but opportunity, the next thing to do. Giulia's older son, Tommaso, was learning the cloth business the way Giulia herself had learned it, by being present. He went with her to the suppliers. He sat beside her when she received buyers. He watched her read the quality of cloth, the touch of the hand running across the surface, the slight tug to test the weave's tightness, the examination of the selvage to see how evenly the loom had woven, and he practiced this reading himself, his mother correcting him without embarrassment when he was wrong. He was 16. He had the eagerness of a boy who wants to be competent and the slight clumsiness of a boy whose hands are still learning what his eyes have already understood. Giulia was patient with him. She had more patience with him than she had with most other things. She did not tell him that she found the business lonely since his father died. That was not information a mother gave a son. She told him when he was right and when he was wrong and why. She told him about the customer who had failed to pay a bill 3 years ago and what she had done about it, and what you could and could not do when a customer in poor financial health owed you money. She told him that the quality of your word was the quality of your business, and that this was especially true for a woman managing a business without a husband, where the margin for the reputation of unreliability was considerably thinner than for a man in the same position. Tommaso listened. He was, she thought, going to be good at this. Not her, not yet, perhaps not ever, because she had learned in a specific way under specific pressures that had made her what she was, but good. Good enough to keep the family in the position it occupied. Good enough to marry well, which would help. Good enough. The workshop of Benedetto was not the most famous workshop in Florence in 1480. The most famous workshop in Florence in 1480 was probably that of Andrea del Verrocchio, who was both sculptor and painter, and whose workshop at this time included a young Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo had been in Verrocchio's workshop since the age of 14 and had, by 1480, been working alongside the master for nearly 15 years. He was producing work of extraordinary originality. The Annunciation now in the Uffizi is from this period. The unfinished Adoration of the Magi began this year, and was beginning to understand that his interests exceeded what any single commission could contain. He would leave Florence for Milan in 1482. But in 1480, he was still there. The city that contained him also contained Botticelli, who was working on the Primavera. It contained Ghirlandaio, in whose workshop a young Michelangelo would shortly be apprenticed. It contained Filippino Lippi, Perugino, Piero di Cosimo. The density of artistic talent in Florence in the last decades of the 15th century was, by any historical measure, extraordinary. The question of why this density existed, why these specific people, in this specific place, at this specific time, is one that art historians have been arguing about for 500 years without reaching a settled answer. The Medici patronage is part of it. The guild structure that organized workshop training is part of it. The presence of ancient sculpture and architecture to learn from is part of it. The intellectual culture of Florentine humanism that elevated the status of the artist and gave the work a philosophical seriousness is part of it. And beyond all these structural explanations, there is the fact that talented people attract other talented people, that a place where good work is being done becomes a place where people who want to do good work want to be, and the concentration feeds itself. Marco had come to Florence because his uncle knew a man who knew Benedetto. He had come because the alternative was the farm. He was not Leonardo, he was not Botticelli. He was a 19-year-old boy from the countryside who had just been allowed to paint a sky. But he was in Florence, and Florence was where it was happening. The plague had visited Florence 7 times in the previous century. The Black Death of 1348, the first and worst visitation of the Yersinia pestis bacterium that would reshape European demography and society, had killed approximately half of Florence's population. From a pre-plague population of perhaps 90,000, the city had fallen to 45,000 in the years following the epidemic. It had never fully recovered to its pre-plague peak. The Florence of 1480, with 50,000 inhabitants, was still smaller than the Florence of 1340. But the plague was not just a demographic event. It was a psychological event of the first magnitude, a demonstration that the world could, without warning, destroy half of everything. The generation that survived the Black Death had lived through the death of their parents, their children, their neighbors, their guilds, their city's economic and social structures. The trauma of this was real and was processed in ways that shaped the culture for generations afterward. The intense religiosity of the late medieval period, the obsessive concern with death and the afterlife visible in the period's art, the dance of death imagery that appears in so many late medieval churches. These were responses to a world that had demonstrated its capacity for catastrophic lethality. The Renaissance, the scholars argue, was partly a response to this, a turn toward life, toward beauty, toward the assertion of human dignity and human capacity in the face of a world that had shown it could take everything. Whether this is the right way to understand the Renaissance is debated, but it is at least plausible. The Florentines who built the dome and painted the frescoes and wrote the humanist treatises lived in a city whose streets were still marked by the gaps where houses had been abandoned in the plague years and not yet rebuilt. They knew what the world could do. They built anyway. The evening meal in Giulia's household was the main meal of the day. In Florence, as in most of Mediterranean Europe, the rhythm of eating was organized differently from the Northern European pattern. The midday meal was substantial, taken after the morning's work, a break in the day, and the evening meal was also substantial. Breakfast was light, bread, perhaps an egg, a cup of the weak wine that accompanied every meal in a world where water was frequently unsafe. The evening meal that Giulia's cook prepared for the household was simple but adequate. A soup of the white beans that were the staple of Tuscan cooking, with a little salt pork for flavor. A plate of dressed greens, bitter autumn greens, dressed with the olive oil that was the region's primary fat. Bread from the morning, a small piece of cheese, some wine. This was not luxurious eating. But it was regular eating, which was not guaranteed, and it was good eating in the sense that Tuscan cooking has always been good. Simple ingredients handled well, the quality of the materials making the case for the dish without elaborate preparation. Giulia ate with her sons at the long table in the upper floor sala. She asked about Roberto's Latin lesson. Roberto said that the monk who taught him was wrong about the subjunctive in a particular construction. Giulia said that she was not in a position to adjudicate this. Tommaso said Roberto was always wrong about grammar. Roberto said Tommaso didn't know what a subjunctive was. Giulia said, "Enough." They finished their beans in a silence that was not hostile but simply the silence of a meal. This was the domestic life of a merchant family. Not magnificent, sufficient, the beans were good. The city of Florence had an ongoing relationship with its past that was different from the relationship most cities have with theirs. Most cities build on top of their past, literally, the new construction going over the old, the layers accumulating until the original is buried so deep that only archaeology can find it. Florence did this too. But it also, uniquely in this period, consciously looked at its past, the Roman past especially, the ancient buildings that remained above ground and tried to learn from what it saw. The Roman theater in the hills outside the city, the fragments of ancient inscription that turned up in construction work, the ancient coins and gems that collectors gathered, all of this was studied with a new seriousness in the 15th century. The humanists who edited ancient Latin texts, and the artists who studied ancient sculpture, and the architects who measured ancient buildings were all engaged in the same project, the recovery of a standard of excellence that the present could learn from. This was not antiquarianism, not the passive collection of old things. It was active learning. You measured the Roman columns not to preserve their proportions, but to apply them to the new buildings you were designing. You copied the ancient sculpture not to reproduce it, but to understand the underlying principles of the human form that the sculpture embodied. You edited the ancient texts not to admire the Latin, but to extract the ideas and apply them to the questions of your own time. The past was a resource. The past was a library. The past was, in the specific Florentine use of it, the raw material for making the present better. This is a fundamentally optimistic relationship with history. It assumes that learning is possible, that standards can be recovered, that the human capacity for excellence can be renewed by contact with its own previous expressions. Whether this assumption is correct is a question that the subsequent 5 centuries have not fully resolved. But Florence bet on it, and the bet produced the Duomo and the David, and the birth of Venus and the Primavera, and the Uffizi full of things that people are still traveling from every corner of the world to see. That is a substantial return on the bet. The night of the day that Marco painted his sky, he went to the tavern near the workshop with 2 of the other apprentices. This was not a common occurrence. Apprentices in Florence were not particularly well paid, and tavern visits were an expense to be balanced against the cost of materials they sometimes bought for themselves. But the occasion felt like something worth marking. He had painted a sky. It was a small sky in the upper quarter of a panel that was itself not a major commission. But it was his. The tavern was called something that no one used. Everyone knew it by the name of the proprietor, a large, cheerful woman named Marta, whose wine was acceptable and whose prices were honest. The apprentices sat at a bench by the wall and drank Marta's wine and talked about what they talked about. The other workshops of the city, the gossip of the trade, the quality of a specific detail in the Verrocchio workshop's latest work, the question of whether one technique for foreshortening was superior to another. They were 19th century in their obsession with technique in the way that people obsessed with craft always are. The specific detail of the making was more interesting than the abstract question of the purpose. Marco drank his wine and listened more than he talked. He was still the newest of the group, still earning his position in the workshop's social hierarchy. He thought about the sky, not about whether it was good. He knew it was approximately good. He thought about where it had failed to be excellent, the specific place in the gradation where the transition was slightly too abrupt, where a more experienced hand would have smoothed it. He filed this. He would correct it next time. That was how you got better, not by celebrating what worked. by noting what didn't and carrying the note into the next attempt. Sir Cristofano walked home from his office in the early evening through the streets of Florence and thought, as he often did on this walk, about very little. This was deliberate. The day had been full of other people's concerns. The widow, whose husband's estate was contested by his brother, the merchant partnership that was dissolving acrimoniously, the young man trying to secure the documentation for a property he claimed to have inherited. All of these people had come to him with their problems and their emotions, and their conviction that their situation was both unique and urgent. He had handled each one with the professional calm of a man who has seen every version of every situation and knows that they are neither unique nor, usually, as urgent as they feel. But the accumulated weight of other people's concerns was real. The walk home was the decompression. The streets of Florence at the end of the working day were full of people doing the same thing, the movement of the city's working population toward home, toward the evening meal, toward the private life that the public day had been working for. He passed the Duomo. He did not look at it. You stopped seeing the things that were always there. He passed the market stalls that were packing up for the evening. He bought a small bunch of dried figs from a vendor who was loading his cart. He ate one fig on the street, which was slightly undignified for a man of his professional standing, but the dignity could absorb it. He arrived home. His wife had his supper ready. He sat down. He ate. He told her about the contested estate because she had known the dead man's family. She told him about the neighbor's new baby. They talked about the fig which he had brought her. This was the evening, not magnificent, sufficient. The fig was very good. The relationship between religion and daily life in Florence was different from what a modern secular person might expect. It was not the relationship of someone who identifies as religious and practices their faith. It was the relationship of someone whose entire world was organized within a religious framework, where the hours of the day were marked by church bells, where the year's rhythm was the liturgical year, where the language of meaning was fundamentally theological. Even the most worldly Florentine merchant, even Lorenzo de' Medici with his Platonic philosophy and his classical learning, operated within a world where the divine was not a matter of optional belief, but the fundamental structure of reality. The question was not whether to be religious. The question was what kind of religious life your specific circumstances permitted. Chiara's life at the convent was organized entirely around this question. The canonical hours, the daily mass, the communal prayers, the silent reading of scripture in the hours assigned to Lectio Divina, these were not separate from her embroidery work. They were the context in which the embroidery work happened and from which it derived its meaning. She was not producing decorative objects. She was producing material expressions of the faith, vestments, and altar cloths that would be used in the liturgy, that would be present at the Mass, that would be part of the prayer. The Virgin's face in the cope was not a portrait of a beautiful woman. It was a material instantiation of a theological reality. Getting it right was a form of prayer. Getting it wrong was a form of failure that went beyond the craft. This is a different kind of pressure from the pressure of producing good work for a commercial patron. It is the pressure of producing good work for God. Chiara handled this pressure by attending to the stitch rather than the theological weight of the stitch. If you think about what the stitch means, you cannot make the stitch correctly. If you make the stitch correctly, the meaning takes care of itself. This was, she thought, probably true of most things. The housing of Florence in 1480 ranged from the magnificent to the genuinely squalid. The great palaces of the Medici and the other leading families, the Palazzo Medici, the Palazzo Strozzi that Filippo Strozzi was in the process of building, the various family palaces in the city's better streets, were buildings of imposing scale and deliberate grandeur, their rusticated stone facades a statement of permanence and power. Inside, they were furnished with an opulence that reflected both genuine wealth and the necessity of display. Tapestries on the walls against the cold, painted wooden ceilings, painted cassoni for storage, painted panels of religious subjects in the camera, the private rooms. The furniture was heavy, dark, and expensive. The floors were tile or stone. The heating was inadequate by any modern standard. The palace's scale made it inherently cold in winter, and the fireplaces that were the primary heat source could warm a small area near themselves and nothing beyond it. The great families wore a lot of clothing in winter as a matter of necessity. In the narrow streets behind these palaces, in the buildings that crowded against them, the housing was different. The wool workers who processed the raw fleece that entered the industry from the English, Spanish, and North African trade networks lived in rooms that were small, dark, shared with other families, and heated by a single brazier if they were heated at all. They slept on straw-filled mattresses on raised wooden beds if they were prosperous or on the floor if they were not. They had few possessions. A skilled weaver or fuller might have a chest, some cooking equipment, the tools of his trade. An unskilled laborer might have less. The distance between the Medici palace and the room of a wool worker was not measured in miles. It was measured in a few streets. It was a city in which you could walk from the greatest wealth in Europe to genuine poverty in 10 minutes. Florence did not find this remarkable. Florence had always been this way. The Florentine wool trade was the economic engine beneath everything. The Art della Lana was one of the 7 major guilds and controlled an industry that employed a significant fraction of the city's population. Not just the skilled weavers and fullers who were guild members, but the larger mass of unskilled workers who processed the raw wool in the earlier stages of production. The Ciompi, the wool carders, were at the bottom of this labor hierarchy, doing the most physical, least skilled, and worst paid work in the industry. In 1378, a century before the time we are considering, the Ciompi had revolted. The Ciompi revolt was a brief uprising of wool workers demanding political representation and better working conditions, one of the first recorded labor revolts in European history. It had been suppressed. The Ciompi had not gotten their guild. They had not gotten their political representation. The structure of the industry had not fundamentally changed, but the revolt was remembered. It was remembered by the families of the workers who had participated in it. It was remembered by the guild masters and merchants who had been on the other side of it. It was remembered as evidence that the city's social peace was conditional, that the workers at the base of the economic pyramid were not infinitely patient, that the distance between the table of the great merchants and the diet of the wool carder was a source of tension that periodically expressed itself. In 1480, the Ciompi revolt was 100 years in the past. The city was peaceful. But the conditions that had produced the revolt, the concentration of wealth, the legal and political exclusion of the working poor, the gap between the table of the merchant and the table of the carder had not changed. They had, if anything, intensified. Marco finished The Sky on a Friday in late October. He stood back from the panel and looked at what he had done. The Sky occupied the upper quarter of a panel approximately 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, a small panel, not a major work. But the Sky was correct. It was not brilliant. It was not the sky of a genius. But it was the sky of a competent painter who understood the gradation from deep blue at the zenith to the lighter, more silvery blue near the horizon, who had applied the paint in the correct layers with the correct brushwork, who had corrected the abrupt transition he had noticed earlier and smoothed it to something that read as continuous. Benedetto looked at it for a full minute. He said, "You have earned the figure." This was the next stage. The figure, the angel of the Annunciation, would be painted by one of the journeymen, as this was the central element of the composition and required more experience than Marco had. But Marco would paint the architectural background of the scene, the loggia, the pilasters, the floor tiles, the garden wall visible through the arch. These were complex elements. They required the correct application of perspective. They required the rendering of stone and marble and tile, different textures, different ways of taking light. They were not the figure, but they were not nothing. Marco looked at the sky once more. Then he turned to the perspective diagram pinned to the workshop wall and began to calculate the vanishing point of the loggia. The sky was done. There was more to do. There was always more to do. The city at night had its own rules and its own population. The gates were closed at the sound of the final bell of the evening. Travelers arriving after closing time had to spend the night outside the walls or seek entrance at one of the minor gates that were kept open under specific conditions. Inside the walls, movement at night was theoretically restricted to those who had legitimate reasons to be out. The watch, the night patrol, enforced this with varying degrees of rigor depending on the political temperature of the moment. In generally quiet times, the watch was more tolerant. In tense times, and Florence had known many tense times, the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478 being only 2 years in the past, the patrol was stricter, and the scrutiny of anyone out after dark was more aggressive. The Pazzi conspiracy had been an attempt to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano at High Mass in the Duomo. Giuliano had been stabbed 19 times and killed. Lorenzo had escaped, wounded. The aftermath, the Medici retribution against the Pazzi family and their associates, the executions, the property confiscations, the diplomatic crisis with the Pope who had been implicated in the conspiracy, had consumed the city for years. The city in 1480 was still in the aftermath. The tension was lower, but the watch was still vigilant. And the Florentines who moved through the city's nighttime streets moved with an awareness, not always conscious, that the city's political peace was something that could be disrupted, had been disrupted within memory, and required maintenance that was never entirely complete. Giulia knew about the Pazzi conspiracy. Every Florentine merchant knew about it. She filed it in the same place where she filed information about which customers paid late and which suppliers were reliable. The world was what it was. You maintained your position within it. You kept good accounts. You got the bread in before dark. The Arno had flooded 6 times in the previous century. Florentines built near rivers and accepted the price of this proximity. The flood risk was known, was discussed, was priced into the real estate of the lower-lying streets near the river. The workshops and houses nearest the water were cheaper, occupied by the families who could not afford to be further away. When the Arno rose, in the autumn rains, when the water coming down from the Apennines overwhelmed the river's ordinary capacity, the first streets to flood were the poorest streets. The wool-washing operations nearest the water got flooded. The low-lying neighborhoods got flooded. The great palaces on the higher ground did not get flooded, or got flooded less severely, or had the resources to recover from the flooding more quickly. This pattern, the wealthy on high ground, the poor on low ground, the environmental risk distributed according to economic position, is as old as cities and as persistent as anything in human history. Florence's floods destroyed records, damaged goods, killed livestock, occasionally killed people. They were treated as natural disasters, which they were. They were also the predictable consequence of a specific form of urban development, which they also were. The city rebuilt after each flood. It continued to build in the same places. The Arno continued to flood. This cycle would not fully change until the engineering works of the 20th century. The Great Flood of 1966, still within living memory for some Florentines, destroyed irreplaceable works of art in the basements of the city's museums and libraries. The Arno was patient. The city was stubborn. They had been having this argument for 1,500 years. The humanist scholars of Florence had developed a concept that was new in the history of ideas, the dignity of man. Pico della Mirandola, who was 17 in 1480 and would shortly come to Florence to join the circle around Lorenzo, would articulate this concept in what became its definitive form, the Oration on the Dignity of Man, written in 1486. The argument was this, that the human being is unique among creation in having no fixed nature, no predetermined essence. The angels have their nature fixed, the animals have their nature fixed, only the human being is placed at the center of the world and given the freedom to determine what it will become. The human being is, in this view, essentially self-defining. It can descend to the vegetative, the animal, the merely material, or it can ascend to the angelic, the rational, the divine. The choice is genuinely free, and this freedom is the human being's dignity. This was a radical idea. It was not entirely new. There were ancient precedents, both classical and Christian. But its specific formulation, its emphasis on freedom and self-determination in a period when the medieval conception of a fixed social and cosmic hierarchy was still the dominant mental framework, was genuinely novel. The Renaissance conception of the artist as creator, not merely craftsman but creator, a term that had previously been reserved for God alone, was related to this concept. If the human being was defined by its creative freedom, then the artist who exercised this freedom most fully was realizing human nature most completely. Marco would not have known Pico. He would not have read the Oration. He was an apprentice painter in a workshop, not a philosopher at Lorenzo's court. But the air he breathed in Florence was the air that Pico and Ficino and the Platonic Academy were producing. He was, in the painting of his sky, doing something that the culture around him had decided was important. Not saving lives, not building empires, painting sky. And somehow, in the strange valuation of that particular place and time, this mattered. The convent's garden was Sister Chiara's second practice after the embroidery. It was not a formal garden. The convent did not have the space or the resources for the elaborate garden culture that the great Florentine villas maintained. But there was a cloister garden, a square of ground enclosed by the colonnade, with a well at the center, a few fruit trees, beds of herbs that the kitchen used and that the infirmarian used for medicines. Chiara tended the herb beds, in the time allocated for physical labor outside the workshop. She grew the lavender that the convent used in the linen storage, and the rosemary that flavored the kitchen's lamb, and the chamomile for the infirmarian's calming infusions, and several varieties of medicinal herbs whose applications she had learned from the previous infirmarian, who had died 5 years ago, and whose knowledge was preserved in a handwritten notebook that Chiara had inherited and maintained. The garden work was different from the embroidery in that it required a different quality of attention. The embroidery required sustained, fine-grained concentration, the specific demands of the needle and the thread, minute to minute. The garden required a more distributed awareness, the overall state of the bed, the condition of the soil, the signs of weather or pest or disease that required response. Both attentions were forms of care. Both required presence. The difference between them was restful in the way that changing between two modes of effort is restful, not because one requires less than the other, but because they require different things, and the alternation prevents the exhaustion that comes from doing the same thing continuously. She pruned the lavender in autumn. The lavender's smell was intensified by cutting. She held the cut stems for a moment before putting them in the basket. The smell was clean and sharp and warm simultaneously, the kind of smell that is so completely itself that it seems to carry the whole of the thing it comes from. She put the stems in the basket. She moved to the next plant. The garden was not finished. The garden was never finished. This, she had learned, was the point of a garden. Lorenzo de' Medici was, by 1480, beginning to feel the financial consequences of his patronage. The Medici Bank, which had been the most powerful banking institution in Europe under his grandfather Cosimo and his father Piero, was not thriving under Lorenzo. Not failing, not yet. But the branches in Bruges and London were performing poorly. The manager of the Bruges branch was making decisions that Lorenzo had not authorized and that were losing money. The manager of the London branch was overextended in loans to the English crown, loans that the English crown was not currently in a position to repay with any urgency. Lorenzo was not primarily a banker. He was a politician, a poet, a patron. His talent was for managing relationships, the complex social and political relationships that kept the city's various factions in the balance that allowed the Medici's informal authority to persist. The bank's management required a different talent, The precise financial attention that his grandfather had exercised and that Lorenzo had not quite inherited. He knew this. He did not, in 1480, have a clear solution to it. He continued to spend on patronage. He continued to commission art and fund scholarship and maintain the network of client relationships that was the real basis of Medici power. The art and the scholarship would survive him. The bank would not. He did not know this yet, or perhaps he knew it and had decided that some things were worth more than the bank. A man who chose to fund the painting of the Primavera and the construction of San Lorenzo and the translation of Plato when he could have been managing his bank more carefully had made a choice about what mattered. Whether the choice was wise or reckless depends on what you value. He died in 1492 at 43. His death began the unraveling. But in 1480, in the middle of what history would call the golden age of his Florence, none of this was visible. The patronage continued. The art continued. The city was in the middle of its own best moment. The Ponte Vecchio at midday was the commercial heart of a city that was already a commercial heart. The goldsmith shops that lined the bridge, or at this point, the goldsmith and butcher shops, the butchers being displaced by the Medici in the next century, because the smell of their trade was deemed unsuitable for the bridge that connected the Medici Palazzo to the Palazzo della Signoria, were busy in the way of specialist retail in a wealthy city. The goldsmiths of Florence were not merely craftsmen. They were artists in a medium that the city valued as highly as painting or sculpture. Ghiberti, who had designed the bronze doors of the baptistry, the gates of paradise that Michelangelo would later call by that name, had begun his career as a goldsmith. Brunelleschi, who had built the dome, had also trained as a goldsmith. The metalworking tradition that produced fine jewelry and devotional objects, and the ornamental work that decorated the city's churches and households, was the same tradition that produced the architectural and sculptural masterpieces. The craft was unified at its foundations. Giulia stopped at the bridge on her way to a supplier meeting, not to buy but to observe. She made this stop occasionally. She found it useful to see what the goldsmiths were displaying, what the prosperous Florentines who could afford their work were buying, what the taste of the moment was. This information was not directly applicable to the cloth trade, but taste in one luxury good tracked with taste in others, and a merchant who was ignorant of the general direction of the city's aesthetic preferences was a merchant who was operating with less information than she could have. She looked at a brooch in a goldsmith's display, enamel work on gold, the kind of thing that a wealthy woman might wear to church. She noted the colors. She moved on, information gathered, meeting to attend. The city was still going on around her. It had not stopped for her observation. Cities never did. The Florentine Republic that existed in 1480 would not exist in the same form for much longer. The events of the coming decades would fundamentally transform the city's political character. Lorenzo would die in 1492. His son Piero would be expelled in 1494, when the French invasion of Italy made the Medici's political position untenable. The Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola would rise to dominate the city's politics, preaching against the luxury and worldliness of Medici Florence and organizing the bonfire of the vanities, the burning of artworks, books, mirrors, cosmetics, and other objects of secular culture in 1497. Savonarola would be executed in 1498 in the same piazza where he had burned the vanities. The Medici would return, leave, return again. The Florence of 1480, this specific Florence, with this specific balance of patronage and commerce and the density of artistic talent that made it unlike any other place on earth, was a temporary thing. The people who lived in it did not know it was temporary. They could not know. The present always feels permanent from inside. Giulia had no idea that within 15 years the city's politics would be unrecognizable. Marco had no idea that the tradition he was learning would soon be called High Renaissance and would be associated primarily with cities other than the one he was learning it in. Chiara had no idea that Savonarola's Puritan revival would briefly dominate the convent's world and then end in his execution. They were living in the middle of their own moment, which is the only place anyone can live. They were doing their work. The city was being what it was, and what it was in 1480 in this specific moment was extraordinary. Even for the people in the middle of it, even for Giulia counting her accounts and Marco grinding his pigments and Cristofano documenting other people's lives, there was something in the air, something that was happening, the making of something that would last. They felt it, though they could not have said what it was, and they would not have known the word for it. The word was Renaissance, but they did not need the word. They had the work. The evening that Marco finished the sky, he sat on the step outside the workshop in the dark and looked at the street. The Via dei Servi was quiet. The last vendors had packed up. The city was in the hour between the end of the workday and the beginning of the night, when the streets hold the last warmth of the occupied day before the cold of the empty night settles in. He was thinking about light. He had been thinking about light all afternoon. The sky he had painted was a daytime sky, the clear, high blue of a Florentine autumn afternoon. But the quality of light in a painting was not simply a question of depicting the color of sky. It was the question of how light fell on the figures and objects below the sky, how it defined their forms, how it created the shadows that gave the flat surface its apparent depth, how the specific direction and quality of the light source organized everything else in the picture. He had been watching light all day. The way the afternoon light came through the workshop's high window and struck the white wall at a specific angle that showed every imperfection in the plaster. The way the same light an hour later had moved and was catching the edge of a prepared panel on the shelf, making the panel's white ground glow like something lit from within. He had not painted either of these observations. He had stored them. This was what Benedetto had told him early in the apprenticeship. You are always collecting. You may not always know you are collecting, but if you pay attention, the collection accumulates, and when you need it, it is there. He did not know when he would need today's light. He knew he was collecting it. He went inside. He cleaned his brushes. He went to bed. The humanist program of education that Florence developed in the 15th century was called the Studia Humanitatis. It was a curriculum built around 5 disciplines: grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy, all studied through the Latin and increasingly the Greek classical texts. This was a departure from the medieval university curriculum, which had been organized around the scholastic philosophy of the Church Fathers and the Aristotelian logic that the scholastics used to structure their arguments. The Studia Humanitatis was explicitly secular in its content. The texts were pagan. The values they embodied were the values of the Roman Republic and the Greek city-state. And yet the humanists who developed and taught this curriculum were, in the main, sincere Christians. They did not see a contradiction. They believed, or constructed a position in which they could believe, that the wisdom of the ancients and the truth of Christianity were compatible, that one could learn from Cicero and Virgil without abandoning the faith. This synthesis was not always convincing. Savonarola would argue that it was corrupting, that the secular culture of the Renaissance was a distraction from the only thing that ultimately mattered, the salvation of the soul. But in 1480, the synthesis was holding, and the Studia Humanitatis was producing a generation of Florentines who could read classical Latin, who had internalized the rhetorical models of Cicero, who thought about civic life and moral questions in terms drawn from the Roman tradition. Cristofano had received this education. He could read Cicero. He could cite Livy. He thought about the law in terms that were as much Roman as they were medieval canon law. This did not make him a better notary in any technical sense, but it gave him a way of understanding the city's life, its commerce, its politics, its institutions that had a certain grandeur to it. He was not just documenting transactions. He was participating in the continuation of a civic tradition that went back to Rome. Whether this was true was debatable, but it made the work feel significant, and feeling that one's work is significant is not a trivial thing. The women of Florence occupied a position that was more complicated than the public legal structure suggested. The public legal structure was clear. Women were under the authority of their fathers until marriage, of their husbands after marriage, and after widowhood were in a liminal position that the law addressed inconsistently. They could not hold public office. They could not be guild members in their own right. They could not, in most circumstances, represent themselves in legal proceedings without a male guardian. This structure was real, but the gap between the legal structure and the actual exercise of power and agency was, as in most societies, considerable. Giulia operated a business without formal guild membership, because her business was technically a continuation of her husband's business, and the legal fiction of the continuing household enterprise gave her the operational space she needed. She was not unusual. The widows and wives of Florentine merchant families who managed businesses, households, and estates were a recognized social category, even if the legal structure did not quite accommodate what they actually did. The correspondence of the Dattini merchant household, the letters of Francesco Dattini and his wife Margherita, which survive in extraordinary completeness in the Prato archive, shows a woman managing a complex household and business enterprise with a level of competence and authority that the formal legal structure would not have been able to describe. Margherita Dattini wrote to her husband with opinions, complaints, business assessments, and the kind of direct practical authority that the theory of patriarchal authority would have predicted she did not have. This was the real life of Florentine merchant women, not the legal theory, the actual management of the actual household and the actual business in the actual conditions of the actual day. Giulia understood this. She had never wasted time grieving over what the law said she could not do. She was too busy doing it. The night before the Feast of All Saints, the city was in the kind of autumn quiet that came when the weather turned cold enough to keep people indoors. The market had been subdued. The guild offices were closing early in preparation for the next day's observances. The churches were preparing for the all-night vigil that the feast required. Giulia was reviewing her accounts. She did this at the end of every month, a complete review of all outstanding transactions, all payments due, all outstanding orders and their expected delivery dates. The accounts were kept in her own hand, in the double entry system that had been developed by the Florentine merchants of the previous century, and that she had learned from her husband and improved upon. Double entry bookkeeping is not inherently exciting. It requires patience, precision, and a willingness to reconcile discrepancies that can sometimes be traced to nothing more interesting than a transcription error 2 months ago. But it is the most honest conversation a merchant can have with their own business. Every number is either correct or it is not. Every balance either balances or it does not. The accounts do not lie. They may have errors introduced by human fallibility, but the system correctly applied will find those errors because every transaction has 2 sides, and if the 2 sides do not balance, something is wrong. She found a transcription error. A payment received from the Strozzi factor correctly logged in the cash account, not yet transferred to the receivables account where it belonged. A small error, easily corrected. She corrected it. The balance balanced. She closed the ledger. She called her sons for dinner. It was the Feast of All Saints. The dead were remembered. The living ate their soup. This was the correct order of things. The morning after All Saints, Marco began work on the loggia. The architectural background of the Annunciation, the loggia in which the Virgin was receiving the angel's news, required the construction in paint of a specific kind of space, an open arcade, classical in its details, with arches and pilasters and a tiled floor that receded into depth. He had measured the perspective carefully. He had done the construction with chalk lines on the panel before beginning to paint, establishing the vanishing point, the orthogonals, the horizon. The perspective was correct. Now the question was whether the painted stone would read as stone. This was the question of texture, the representation of a material's specific quality of surface. Stone is not uniform. Different stones have different textures, different ways of taking light, different colors. The marble that a 15th-century Florentine patron would expect to see in the loggia of a high-status Annunciation was the white marble of Carrara, the same marble that Michelangelo would use for the David 23 years later, the marble that had been quarried in the Apennines and shipped down the Arno to Florence for centuries. White marble has a specific quality. It reflects light, but it also transmits it slightly, has a slight subsurface luminosity that distinguishes it from painted stone that is merely white. Getting this quality in paint required a specific technique, not a single application of white paint, but a layered application that created the impression of depth below the surface. Marco had seen this done in Benedetto's work. He had not yet done it himself. He mixed his lead white and his thin glaze layer. He began. The stone began to have a surface. He could not yet tell if it was the right surface. That would take another day. He worked until the light failed. The Florence that exists now, the Florence that receives millions of visitors a year, that is classified as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, that contains in its museums and churches and streets the concentrated artistic legacy of the 15th and 16th centuries, is not the Florence of 1480. It is the archive of that Florence. The Uffizi Gallery, which contains the Primavera and the Birth of Venus and dozens of other works from this period, was built by Cosimo I de' Medici as administrative offices, the Uffizi, the offices beginning in 1560. It became a gallery later. The David of Michelangelo, which stands now in the Accademia, was made between 1501 and 1504, 20 years after the time we have been considering. The world's most visited museum contains the concentrated residue of a moment that lasted perhaps 100 years, produced by a city of 50,000 people, the products of workshops and commissions, and the specific conditions of patronage and competition, and the density of talent that the era assembled. Marco's altarpiece panel. If it survived, if it was preserved, if it made its way through the 500 years of fires and floods and wars, and neglect that claims most of what is made, would not be in the Uffizi. It would be in a small chapel somewhere, possibly still in its original location, possibly moved at some point to a museum or private collection. Or it would not exist. Most of what was made does not exist. What we have is the exception. The survival of a work of art is not primarily about its quality. It is about its location, its material, its luck, and the changing tastes and priorities of the people who inherited custody of it. We have the Primavera because the Medici valued it and kept it. We do not have the equivalent work by the equally talented painter who made it for a patron whose family was dispersed in the upheavals of the following century, whose work ended up in a church that burned, whose name we do not know. The archive is not the history. The archive is what the archive is. The closing prayer at the convent was Compline, the last of the canonical hours, the prayer that ended the day. Chiara stood in the choir with the other sisters, and the sung prayers moved through the space of the chapel in the way that sung prayers in stone spaces always move, not merely heard but felt, the vibration of voices in a resonant space, the sound becoming something more than sound. The text of Compline was familiar to the point of being part of her interior furniture, the hymn, the psalm, the short reading, the response, the final blessing. She had said these words thousands of times. She would say them thousands more. The repetition was not the enemy of meaning. It was the condition for meaning. To say the same words every evening for 30 years was to have a different relationship with those words than someone who said them for the first time. The words had been said by every generation before her. They would be said by every generation after. She was the current instance of their saying. When she was gone, the words would continue. The chapel would continue. The candlelight would be there as it was now. This was, she found, comforting, not in a way she could fully explain. But the continuity of the practice was itself a form of assurance that what she was doing had been found worth doing continuously by every generation back to the founding. She sang the last note of the final antiphon. The chapel was silent. They went to their cells. The day was over. What Florence made between roughly 1420 and 1520 was something that the world had not seen before and has not seen since in quite those terms. Not because no one else has ever been as talented, not because the specific technical achievements of those 100 years, the perspective system, the dome, the bronze casting, the fresco technique, were irreproducible. They were reproduced continuously by the artists of the following centuries who learned from them. But the specific combination of conditions that produced those achievements, the Medici patronage, the humanist intellectual framework, the guild training system, the density of talent, the physical resources of the marble and the pigments and the skilled craftspeople, the specific civic culture of a republic that competed through beauty, that combination was not reproduced. It was of its time and its place. This is true of every great cultural flowering. The Athenian philosophical tradition of the 5th century BCE, the Tang dynasty poetry of 8th century China, the Song dynasty landscape painting of the 10th and 11th centuries, the Elizabethan theater, the Vienna of the early 20th century. Each of these was the product of specific conditions that converged for a time and then did not. The lesson they offer is not a formula for reproduction. It is something more like proof of possibility, evidence that, under the right conditions, human culture can produce things of extraordinary value. The conditions are never guaranteed. The convergence is never predictable, but it happens. It happened in Florence. The dome stands. The paintings survive. And in the archive of what was made, if you look carefully, you can sometimes find the sky that a 19-year-old apprentice painted with 14 passes of the brush in a small workshop on the Via dei Servi in the autumn of 1480. Not in the Uffizi, somewhere smaller, but there. The last night of October, Giulia went to the window of the upper floor. The city was quiet. The Feast of All Saints was tomorrow, and the city had the particular quiet of an eve, the preparations complete, the celebration not yet begun, a held breath. She could see the lantern of the Duomo's lantern from this window, the topmost point of the structure just visible over the rooftops. She had been in Florence her entire life. She had been looking at this view, or a version of it, for as long as she could remember. The city did not strike her as remarkable. It was simply her city, the place she knew with the intimacy that comes from a life spent in it. She knew which streets were faster in the morning. She knew which market vendors were honest and which needed watching. She knew the rhythm of the Arno's moods through the year. She knew which families were reliable and which were not. She knew the business of this city the way Hana in Kyoto knew her indigo vat in her hands, in her nose, in the knowledge that does not need to be articulated because it is simply present. She thought about her husband, not with grief tonight, with something closer to gratitude. He had built this business. He had left it to her. She had made it better than he had left it. He would have found this, she thought, somewhat embarrassing. He would have said so poorly and she would have pointed to the accounts and he would have conceded. She closed the window. She went to check that the boys were in bed. Tommaso was reading. She could see the lamp under his door. Roberto was asleep. She blew out the landing lamp. She went to her room. The city went on outside. It always went on outside. It had been going on in one form or another for a very long time. It would keep going. That was what cities did. And tomorrow there would be accounts to review and a supplier to meet and a conversation with Tommaso about the terms of the Corsini order. But not tonight. Tonight the city breathed. And Giulia, in her bed above the cloth business she had made her own, breathed with it. The workshop's apprenticeship was a long education in looking. Before you learn to paint, you learn to see. Before you learn to see, you learn to draw. Before you learn to draw, you learn to really look, with the sustained, systematic attention that most people never give to anything. Benedetto had Marco drawing from the first week, not from imagination, from things. He set up objects in the workshop, a piece of drapery draped over a stool, a ceramic jug on a shelf, a cast of a classical relief pinned to the wall, and required Marco to draw what he saw, not what he knew was there, what he saw. The distinction between seeing and knowing is more important than it might appear. The human visual system is not a camera. It does not record what is in front of it neutrally. It interprets. It fills in what experience suggests should be there. It simplifies the complexity of actual surfaces into the cleaner versions that the mind can more easily process. The result of this interpretation is that most people, when they try to draw, do not draw what they see, they draw what they know. They draw the symbol for a hand rather than this hand, these specific fingers, this specific way the light catches the knuckle. Learning to draw, really learning to draw, means learning to override this interpretive tendency, to slow down the process of perception, to actually look at the specific rather than the general. This is why Benedetto required the drawing, not because the drawings were the destination, because the drawing practice trained the eye. An eye trained by years of drawing practice sees differently from an untrained eye. It sees the specific angle of this shadow. It sees the way this particular fabric folds under gravity. It sees the specific quality of the light at this hour on this surface. Marco, 3 years into his training, was beginning to have this eye. He could feel it developing, not as a dramatic revelation but as an accumulation, the same accumulation that built a deep indigo through repeated dipping, the same accumulation that built a stone wall one course at a time. The eye getting better. The seeing becoming more accurate. The gap between what was there and what he could perceive closing. The silk that Giulia traded was not produced in Florence. Florence produced wool cloth. The art della lana was a wool guild. The silk came from elsewhere, from the workshops of Lucca, which had been the silk center of Tuscany before Florence captured its market in the previous century, from Genoa, and increasingly from the east, via the Venetian trade networks that connected the Adriatic port to the Levanten, and eventually the Silk Road commerce. Giulia's business dealt in both domestic wool cloth and imported silk, which put her in a position of managing 2 different supply chains with 2 different sets of relationships. The wool suppliers were local, the fulling mills in the hills outside the city, the finishers in the city's workshops. The silk suppliers were at a remove, Florentine merchants with contacts in Lucca or Venice, or more rarely, in the Levanten ports where Eastern goods first arrived. The letters of credit that made this long-distance commerce possible were the instrument that Giulia used constantly without thinking about their origins. She issued letters of credit. She accepted letters of credit. She presented them for payment and had them presented to her. This system, this financial infrastructure, this paper proxy for physical money, was what allowed a cloth merchant in Florence to do business with a silk supplier in Venice, without either of them having to carry gold across the Apennines. It was also what allowed the Medici Bank to exist. The letter of credit was the fundamental technology of the commercial revolution. It had been invented by Florentines. Giulia used it the way she used a door, without thinking about what made it possible, because the alternative was unimaginable. The hills around Florence were covered in the olive groves and vineyards, and the occasional farm holding that had been the productive hinterland of the city for centuries. The Contado, the countryside under Florence's political authority, was not merely agricultural. It was the source of the raw materials, wool, certain dyes, timber, stone, that the city's industries required. It was also where many of Florence's wealthy families had country villas, retreats from the city that were simultaneously agricultural operations and places for the kind of intellectual sociability that the city's pace did not easily accommodate. The Medici Villa at Chiara, where the Platonic Academy met, was 15 minutes on horseback from the city gate. It was close enough to be practically urban and far enough to feel like a different world, the world of the garden and the leisured conversation, the world where philosophical discussion could happen over time and without interruption. Lorenzo used this villa for the recuperation of his gout, which was the hereditary Medici affliction that would eventually contribute to his death. He also used it for the gathering of the scholars and artists and poets who defined Florence's cultural moment. The conversations that happened at Chiara about Plato and the nature of love and the relationship between beauty and truth were not merely decorative. They shaped the vocabulary in which the art of the period was conceived and discussed. When Botticelli painted the Primavera, the figures in that painting were intelligible in terms that the Academy's discussions had made available. The painting was not a philosophical treatise, but it was painted by a man who had breathed the Academy's air, who knew the terms of the discussion, whose visual imagination had been shaped by ideas as well as by the observation of the natural world. Art and philosophy were not separate in Florence. They fed each other. The conversation at the villa produced the painting in the workshop. The painting in the workshop made visible what the conversation had been trying to say. The city that Florence became after 1492 was different enough from the city it had been before that historians have treated Lorenzo's death as a kind of ending. The Golden Age, the specific configuration of Medici patronage, humanist scholarship, artistic production, and political stability that had given Florence its particular character, ended with Lorenzo and did not reconstitute itself in quite the same form. The French invasions of the 1490s, Savonarola's brief theocratic republic, the expulsion and eventual return of the Medici, the continuing Italian wars that would reshape the political map of the peninsula, all of this produced a different Florence, not a lesser Florence, necessarily. The 16th century city produced Michelangelo's later work, the Mannerist painters, the continuation of the artistic tradition under changed conditions, but different. The specific quality of the 1480 moment, its confidence, its sense of possibility, its sense that the recovery of ancient excellence was not only achievable but underway, that quality was a product of conditions that were themselves temporary. The people who lived in it did not know it was temporary. They did not know they were in a golden age. Golden ages are only visible in retrospect. From inside, they are simply the present with all the present's specific anxieties and disappointments and ordinary days. Marco's sky, Giulia's accounts, Chiara's needle, Cristofano's ledger, the Arno running past the Ponte Vecchio, the smell of linseed oil before dawn. These were not golden. These were simply the days, and the days accumulated made something that turned out to be extraordinary. This is the nature of extraordinary things. They are made of ordinary days attended to, ordinary days worked through, ordinary days sufficient. The light in Florence was a specific light. This is not a poetic claim. It is a practical claim made by every painter who worked there and noted the specific quality of the Tuscan light. The way the combination of latitude, altitude, the surrounding hills, and the reflective surface of the Arno created an illumination that was different from the light of Venice or Rome or Amsterdam. Tuscan light is clear and strong and directional. It creates sharp-edged shadows with well-defined boundaries. It makes colors appear with a saturation and precision that Northern European light, which is more diffuse and gray-filtered, does not produce. The fresco painters of Tuscany could paint the human figure in this light, and the figure's forms would be legible across the full width of a chapel, the shadow defining the muscle, the highlight catching the edge of the drapery, the whole rendering holding together from 40 feet away. This was not incidental. The visual culture of the Renaissance was in part a response to the light that the Renaissance's artists worked in. You could not make the same paintings in Antwerp, not because the Flemish painters were less talented, they were as talented, but because the light was different and the light shapes what is visible. Marco had come from the countryside north of Florence where the light was similar. He had grown up with Tuscan light without knowing he had grown up with it. He had been seeing it all his life. But in the workshop under Benedetto's instruction, he had begun to see it, not to simply receive it as he always had, to see it, to study its behavior, to understand its rules, to use it. The afternoon light through the workshop window was not just light, it was information. It was telling him things about the surfaces it struck, their angle, their texture, their relationship to the space around them. He was learning to read it. He would spend the rest of his life learning to read it. This was not a problem. This was the work. Sir Cristofano's registers, if they survived, would tell us things that the paintings and the philosophical treatises would not. They would tell us the names of the people who made the transactions that funded the patronage. They would tell us the value of the property that the Florentine merchant families held and the debts they carried. They would tell us which family was prospering and which was struggling in the specific autumn of 1480, before the political upheavals that would come. They would tell us what a cloth merchant's annual turnover was, what a workshop commission cost, what the going rate for a Florentine house in a good neighborhood was in the decade before the Pazzi conspiracy's aftermath changed the city's political economy. They would tell us, in short, the material conditions beneath the art. The art is what survives. The material conditions are mostly gone. The contracts between artists and patrons survive, in a few cases, in the archives. The account books of a few wealthy families survive, but most of the documentation of daily commercial life, of the small transactions, the letters between merchants, the day-to-day accounts of the thousands of Florentine households that were not the Medici, is gone. Cristofano's registers, if they exist anywhere, are in an archive somewhere, unedited, unindexed, waiting for a historian with the patience to read them. They would tell a story that the art cannot tell, not the story of beauty, the story of what made beauty possible, the ordinary life of the city. The accounts, the beans for dinner, the note about the Strozzi payment, the small fig bought from a vendor on the way home, these are not magnificent. These are the substrate. The art grew from this substrate. The substrate made the art possible. And the people who maintained the substrate, who kept the accounts and the contracts and the small commercial transactions of a working city, are the invisible half of the Renaissance story. The Duomo is still there. You can stand beneath it now and look up at the dome and feel what Marco felt when he first arrived from the countryside and stood in the street near the cathedral and understood, for the first time, that things that seemed impossible were sometimes simply things that hadn't been done yet. The dome has been there for nearly 600 years. It has outlasted the Medici and the Florentine Republic and the Italian wars and the bonfire of the Vanities and the 1966 flood, and the various centuries of tourists who have stood beneath it and felt what you feel when something made by human hands exceeds what you believed human hands could make. The dome does not know any of this. It simply stands. It is what Brunelleschi made it. The sky above it is still the Florentine sky, still clear, still directional, still making the sharp-edged shadows that the painters learned from. Marco's sky is somewhere, or it isn't. Either way, the sky that taught him to paint it is still there. Every morning over Florence, the same light. The smell of linseed oil in the morning is still a smell. If you are near a workshop, near any place where something is being made with care, you might catch it. And for a moment you are in Florence, in the autumn of 1480, in the street where the work is already beginning, the loggia is being painted, the needle is moving through the silk, the accounts will balance. The boy from the countryside is learning to see. The city is doing what it has always done. It is being what it is. And what it is tonight is enough. The Arno does not stop at night. It keeps moving as it has moved for 1,000 years, through the city that was built beside it and around it and despite it. The water takes the reflection of the lanterns on the Ponte Vecchio and carries it downstream, and the city sleeps above it. You are in your bed. The smell of linseed oil has faded from the street. Marco's sky is drying in the quiet workshop. Chiara's needle is at rest. Cristofano's ledger is closed. The Arno is running in the dark below the Ponte Vecchio. The Duomo's lantern is the highest point in the city. Sleep well. And that for tonight is Florence, the city where beauty was a team effort and genius was a workshop industry, and the most remarkable 100 years in the history of human art was lived by people who were mostly just trying to get their work done and pay their accounts and get the bread in before dark. Thank you for being here tonight. A new story arrives every day. Subscribe and keep the lamp burning. Tell me where you're listening from. I want to know. Good night.